My name is Jake, and I've always been drawn to the woods. Not in a tree-hugging, granola-munching kind of way, but more like a moth to a flickering, dangerous flame. There's something about the deep, untamed wilderness that just calls to me, a whisper in the rustling leaves that promises well. I used to think it promised adventure. Now I know better. Now, the whisper sounds more like a warning. It started innocently enough, like most bad ideas do. My buddy Mark and I were sitting around his garage, cracking open lukewarm sodas and complaining about the soul-crushing monotony of another summer in our small town. We lived in Havenwood, Ohio, a place about as exciting as watching paint dry, surrounded by miles and miles of dense, ancient forest. You'd think living next to all that nature would be a perk, but when you're 17 and bored out of your skull, even the woods start to feel like part of the problem. Dude, we got to get out of here. Mark groaned, leaning back in his creaky lawn chair. He was staring up at the dusty rafters of the garage, but I knew he was seeing something else escape. Mark's always been the restless type, the kind of guy who's itching for something more, something bigger than Havenwood and its endless cornfields. Where are we going to go? I asked, knowing the answer already. We were perpetually broke, our summer jobs at the local hardware store barely covering gas money, and enough pizza to keep us alive, Mark Sepping, like it was some revolutionary idea. Deep woods camping, like real camping, no campgrounds, no RVs, no screaming kids, just us, the trees, and nature. I raised an eyebrow. You mean like actually roughing it? Sleeping on the ground, eating beans out of a can, wrestling bears? I was being sarcastic, mostly, but a tiny spark of genuine interest flickered in my chest. I'd done some camping before, mostly with my family at designated campsites with picnic tables and fire pits, but Mark was talking about something different, something wilder. Mark grinned, his eyes gleaming with that familiar adventurous glint. Exactly. We'll hike into the Blackwood National Forest. I've heard stories, man. Places out there where people haven't set foot in years. Total wilderness. Blackwood. Even the name sounded ominous. It was a massive stretch of forest that bordered Havenwood, a place locals generally avoided. Too many stories, whispered rumors of strange disappearances, weird noises in the night, and folks just plain getting lost and never coming back. My grandpa used to tell me tales of Blackwood when I was a kid. Spooky campfire stories about creatures lurking in the shadows and a darkness that could swallow you whole. I'd always dismissed them as just old wives' tales, the kind of thing old folks say to scare kids. But still Blackwood had a reputation. Blackwood, I said, trying to sound nonchalant, but I could feel a prickle of unease. Isn't that kind of dangerous? Mark scoffed. Dangerous? Come on, Jake. We're not afraid of a few squirrels, are we? It'll be an adventure. We'll be legends. Think of the stories we'll have to tell. Stories. That was Mark's weakness, and honestly, kind of mine too. We were both suckers for a good story, especially a scary one. And the idea of venturing into Blackwood, of facing the unknown, of coming back with a tale to tell was undeniably appealing. The boredom of Havenwood was a powerful motivator. Okay, I conceded, holding up my hands in mock surrender. You've convinced me, Blackwood it is. But if we get eaten by a bear, I'm haunting you for eternity. Mark laughed, slapping me on the back. Relax, man. We'll be fine. We'll be prepared, I've got this. Prepared how? I asked, already feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Mark's idea of prepared and my idea of prepared were often different. I've been doing some research, Mark said, puffing out his chest like he was Bear Grylls himself. I've got a map of Blackwood, some decent camping gear from my dad's attic, and I've been watching survival videos on YouTube. We'll be practically wilderness experts by the time we go. YouTube survival videos. That didn't exactly fill me with confidence, but I didn't say anything. I was already in, hooked by the promise of adventure and the desperate need to escape the monotony of our lives. Besides, a part of me, a small, reckless part, was actually excited. Maybe Blackwood wouldn't be so bad. Maybe it would even be fun. We spent the next few days preparing. Mark, true to his word, produced a tattered, vaguely topographical map of Blackwood Forest, which looked like it had been drawn by someone with shaky hands and a serious caffeine addiction. The gear from his dad's attic was questionable. A rusty old tent that smelled vaguely of mothballs, a couple of sleeping bags that looked like they'd seen better decades, and a dented camping stove that might or might not explode on first use. But hey, it was gear. I contributed what I could. Decent first aid kit, a sturdy knife my grandpa had given me, and a compass that I actually knew how to use, mostly. We pooled our meager funds and bought some non-perishable food, canned beans, instant noodles, granola bars, and enough trail mix to choke a horse. We were, in our own teenage, slightly delusional way, ready for the wilderness. Our plan was simple: hike into Blackwood, find a secluded spot to set up camp, spend a couple of nights communing with nature, and then hike back out, hopefully in one piece. We decided to go the following weekend. The weather forecast was decent, sunny skies, mild temperatures, perfect camping weather, according to the overly enthusiastic weatherman on TV. What could possibly go wrong? Friday afternoon rolled around, and a nervous energy crackled between Mark and me as we loaded up his beat-up Honda Civic with our gear. My parents, bless their oblivious hearts, just thought we were going to a regular campground. I'd mumbled something about scouting out a new hiking trail, and they'd bought it, no questions asked. They were used to our impulsive schemes by now. As we drove towards Blackwood, the landscape began to change. The familiar cornfields and neatly manicured lawns of Havenwood gave way to thick, encroaching forest. The trees grew taller, denser, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew cooler, damper, and a strange silence descended, broken only by the hum of the car engine and the nervous chatter between Mark and me. We reached the trailhead, a barely marked opening in the trees on the side of a deserted country road. There was a small, weathered sign that read, "Blackwood National Forest, enter at your own risk." Nice and welcoming. Mark grinned, ignoring the ominous warning. "This is it, buddy," he said, killing the engine. "Adventure time." We hauled our packs out of the car, shouldered them, and stepped into the woods. Immediately, the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. The sunlight that had been filtering through the trees on the edge of the forest vanished, replaced by a dim, green, tinged gloom. The sounds of the road, cars, distant traffic faded away, swallowed by the dense foliage. It was like stepping into another world. The trail, if you could call it that, was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen leaves and branches. It wound its way deeper and deeper into the woods, climbing gradually uphill. The trees were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching up like skeletal arms. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, as something musky, almost animalistic. We hiked in silence for a while, the initial excitement giving way to a growing sense of something, unease, anticipation, maybe a little bit of fear. The woods were different than I'd imagined. They weren't just trees and plants and cute woodland creatures. They felt alive, and not in a friendly Disney movie kind of way, more like a watchful, waiting kind of alive. After about an hour of hiking, Mark stopped, consulting his dubious map. Okay, according to this masterpiece of cartography, we should be getting to a decent camping spot soon. There's supposed to be a creek up ahead. We pushed on, the trail getting steeper and more overgrown. The woods seemed to be closing in around us, the trees pressing closer, the shadows deepening. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched, like unseen eyes were following our every move. It was probably just my imagination, nerves getting the better of me, but the feeling was persistent, unsettling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard the sound of running water. The trail opened up into a small clearing next to a narrow, rocky creek. Sunlight filtered through the trees again, dappling the ground and the water with golden light. It was actually kind of beautiful. "Score!" Mark exclaimed, dropping his pack with a thud. A perfect campsite. We're practically pioneers. I had to admit it was a pretty good spot. The clearing was relatively flat, with plenty of space to pitch our tent. The creek looked clean and clear, perfect for filtering water, and the trees around the clearing, while still dense, didn't feel quite as oppressive as they had deeper in the woods. We set about setting up camp, working with a kind of clumsy, teenage efficiency. The tent, predictably, was a pain to assemble, the poles bent and the fabric stiff with age. But eventually, after much cursing and wrestling, we managed to get it standing, a lopsided, slightly pathetic shelter against the vastness of the woods. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something, a bear, a deer, one of those creepy, vaguely humanoid figures from my grandpa's stories. I didn't know what I expected to see, but I knew something was out there. Or maybe, just maybe, it was already in here, in my head playing tricks on me. Once the tent was up, we started gathering firewood. Dry branches and fallen logs were plentiful, and soon we had a decent pile stacked up next to the makeshift fire pit we'd scraped together. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The air was getting colder, and the sounds of the woods were changing. The cheerful chirping of birds had faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the distant, unsettling hooting of an owl. As darkness fell, we huddled around the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. We ate our meagre dinner of canned beans and crackers, the silence punctuated by the crackling fire and the sounds of the night. Mark, ever the optimist, was in high spirits, regaling me with stories of legendary campers and wilderness survivalists. I tried to join in, to match his enthusiasm, but the unease was still there, a cold knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. "You okay, man?" Mark asked, noticing my quietness. "You seem a little spooked." I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Nah, I'm fine. Just thinking, it's just kinda creepy out here, you know." Mark grinned, poking the fire with a stick. Sparks flew up into the darkness, disappearing into the blackness above. "That's the point, dude. That's why we came out here, to get a little spooked. To feel alive." "Yeah, well, I'm feeling pretty alive right now," I said, forcing a laugh. But it sounded hollow even to my own ears. We sat in silence for a while longer, watching the fire burn down, the shadows deepening, the sounds of the woods growing louder, more insistent. The hooting of the owl was closer now, and I could hear other noises too, rustling in the undergrowth, snapping branches, things moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. Things I couldn't see, couldn't identify. Things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Maybe we should turn in?" I suggested, my voice a little too high, pitched for my liking. Mark glanced at me, a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement, concern, maybe even a hint of fear, but he just shrugged. "Yeah, sure. Early start tomorrow, right? Got to conquer Blackwood." We banked the fire, extinguishing the flames with dirt and water from the creek. Then we retreated to the flimsy sanctuary of our tent, zipping up the thin nylon door against the encroaching darkness. Inside it was cramped and stuffy, smelling of mothballs and damp canvas, but it felt safer. A little bit, we lay in our sleeping bags side by side, the silence inside the tent amplifying the sounds of the woods outside. The rustling, the snapping, the hooting, they seemed closer now, surrounding us, pressing in. I could hear the wind sighing through the trees, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers on its breath. Whispers I couldn't quite make out, but that sent shivers down my spine nonetheless. "You hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sounds of the woods. "Hear what?" Mark whispered back, his voice sounding strained. "Just noises. Out there, like something's moving around." Mark was silent for a moment, listening. Then he chuckled nervously. "Probably just animals, man. Deer, raccoons, squirrels, maybe a bear if we're lucky." He tried to sound reassuring, but his voice wavered slightly. "Yeah, maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. The noises outside weren't animal noises. They were different. Heavier, slower, more deliberate. And they seemed to be getting closer. Suddenly, there was a loud snap of a twig right outside the tent. We both froze, holding our breath, listening intently. Silence then, another snap, closer this time, and then a loud guttural growl, a sound that was definitely not a bear. It was deeper, raspier, more inhuman. My heart hammered against my ribs, adrenaline flooding my veins. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the woods. Almost, because beneath the pounding of my heart I could still hear it. The growling, closer now, right outside the tent. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" Mark didn't answer. I could hear him breathing, shallow and rapid, next to me in the darkness. He'd heard it too. Whatever it was, the growling stopped. Silence again. A heavy, oppressive silence that was even more terrifying than the growling. We lay there, frozening, waiting, our senses strained to the breaking point. Then it started, a new sound. Not growling this time, something else. Something wet. A soft, scorching sound, like something heavy was dragging itself through the mud and leaves. And it was getting closer. Slowly, deliberately, coming right towards the tent. The scorching sound stopped right outside the tent wall, just inches from my head. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my lungs burning for air. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but lie there, paralyzed by fear. And then I heard it. The whisper, not in the rustling leaves, not on the wind. Right outside the tent. A low, breathy whisper, so close it felt like it was inside my head. And it was saying something. Something I couldn't quite understand. A jumble of syllables, distorted, inhuman. But somehow I knew what it meant. I knew it in the deepest, most primal part of my brain. It wasn't a promise of adventure, it was a warning. You shouldn't be here. The whisper faded, leaving behind a chilling silence. But the scorching sound was still there, right outside the tent. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond fear, that we were no longer alone in Blackwood Forest. We were being watched. We were being hunted. And our adventure had just turned into a nightmare. The whisper hung in the air, or rather, in my head, even after it was gone. You shouldn't be here. The words, though barely formed, resonated with a chilling authority, a primal truth that burrowed deep into my bones. The scorching sound remained, a constant, sickening reminder of something unseen lurking just beyond the thin nylon wall of our tent. Mark was still frozen beside me, his breathing shallow and ragged. I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. We just lay there, listening, waiting. Our senses on high alert, every nerve ending screaming. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. The woods themselves seemed to hold their breath, the usual nighttime symphony of rustles and chirps replaced by an unnerving stillness. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the trees motionless like silent, watchful sentinels. Then, the scorching started again. Slowly, deliberately, it began to circle the tent. Scorchy scorch, squall each step was agonizingly slow, each sound echoing in the impressive silence, amplified by our fear-charged imaginations. It was like something was pacing us, taking its time savoring our terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, to convince myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, maybe a possum, dragging something wet through the undergrowth. But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals didn't whisper. Animals didn't inspire this kind of gut-wrenching, primal fear. The scorching completed its slow circle of the tent, and then stopped again, right at the back, behind our heads. We were facing the tent door, our eyes fixed on the thin fabric, straining to see any movement, any shadow. But the darkness outside was absolute, impenetrable. The fire was long dead, leaving us in complete blackness, save for the faint, ghostly glow of the moon filtering weakly through the dense canopy above. The silence returned, heavier this time, pregnant with unspoken dread. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the eerie stillness. I risked a glance at Mark. In the dim moonlight filtering through the tent fabric, I could see his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide and staring, fixed on the back wall of the tent, where the squelching had stopped. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, or something far worse. Suddenly, there was a new sound, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across rough bark. It started low, almost inaudible, and then grew louder, closer, until it was right next to the tent, right behind Mark's head. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like something was testing the tent fabric, exploring it, feeling it out. Mark flinched, letting out a small, involuntary gasp. I could feel him trembling beside me, his body rigid with fear. I wanted to say something to reassure him, to reassure myself, but my voice was frozen in my throat, choked by terror. The scraping stopped. Silence again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't just oppressive, it was expectant. Like something was waiting for us to react, waiting for us to make a move, waiting to see what we would do. And then it came. A new sound, and this one was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate sniffing sound right outside the tent door, right where our heads were. Sniff, 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 it was wet, raspy, like an animal sniffing the air, but wrong. Too deep, too guttural, too hungry. I could smell it then too. A smell that cut through the damp earth and decaying leaves. A smell that made my stomach churn. It was musky, full, like rotting meat and wet fur, with a faint, sickly sweet undertone that made my nostrils burn. The smell of something unclean, something unnatural. The sniffing continued right outside the door, punctuated by soft, wet snorts. I could almost feel the hot, fetid breath on the other side of the tent fabric, inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut again, willing myself to disappear, to become invisible, to just not be there. Suddenly, the tent door bulged inwards, right in front of my face. Not a violent shove, but a slow, deliberate pressure, like something heavy was leaning against it, pressing against the thin nylon, testing its strength. I could see the fabric stretching, straining, the zipper groaning under the pressure. I gasp-choked, silent sound, and instinctively recoiled, pressing myself back against the tent wall, away from the bulging door. Mark did the same, scrambling backwards, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the distorted shape pressing against the tent. The pressure on the door increased, slowly, inexorably. The fabric stretched further, becoming translucent, and I could almost make out a shape behind it, a dark, amorphous mass, pressing against the nylon. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a bone, chilling cold that seeped through the tent fabric, through my sleeping bag, right into my skin. And then I saw it. Just a glimpse, just for a fraction of a second, but enough to sear itself into my memory, to haunt my nightmares forever. Through the stretched, translucent fabric of the tent door, I saw an eye. Not a human eye. Not an animal eye, something else. Something wrong. It was huge, disproportionately large, filling almost the entire bulging section of the tent door. It was round black, and utterly devoid of light, like a bottomless pit, sucking in all the surrounding darkness. There was no pupil, no iris, just a vast, empty blackness that seemed to stare right through me, right into my soul, and around the eye I saw texture. Not skin, not fur, not scales. Something slick wet and glistening, like polished obsidian, reflecting the faint moonlight in a disturbing, unnatural way. And were those veins? Thick dark veins, pulsing faintly beneath the slick surface, branching out from the black eye like roots of some unholy tree. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the eye was gone. The pressure on the tent door released, the fabric snapped back into place, and the blackness outside returned, absolute and impenetrable. But the image of that eye remained, burned into my retinas, a terrifying brand seared onto my soul. I gasped for breath, my lungs burning. My heart hammering like a trapped bird, I scrambled backwards, further into the tent, bumping into Mark, who was still pressed against the back wall, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the tent door as if expecting the eye to reappear at any moment. Did you see that? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Mark blinked slowly, like he was just coming back to reality. He turned his head towards me, his face pale and clammy, his eyes still wide with terror. He nodded, slowly, silently. He'd seen it too. What was that? I whispered, the question barely audible, more to myself than to Mark. Mark shook his head, his eyes darting around the tent, as if expecting the creature to burst through the fabric at any moment. I don't know, he stammered, his voice trembling. I don't know what that was. Silence descended again, heavier, more oppressive than ever. The squelching, the scraping, the sniffing all gone. Just the rustling of leaves, the sighing of the wind, and the frantic pounding of our hearts. But the silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm, like something was just waiting, watching. We lay there, huddled together in the darkness, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent jolts of terror through us. We were trapped, paralyzed by fear, waiting for something. We didn't know what, but we knew it was out there, and we knew it wasn't good. Suddenly a new sound broke the silence. A high-pitched, keening sound, like a wounded animal, whimpering in pain. It started far off in the woods, faint and distant, but it was coming closer, rapidly, growing louder with each passing second. We ee. The sound rose in pitch and volume, becoming a piercing, agonizing wail that seemed to vibrate through the trees, through the ground, right into our bones. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pain, a sound that clawed at our nerves, that made our teeth ache, that made us want to cover our ears and scream. What the hell is that? Mark whimpered, his hands clamped over his ears, his face contorted in agony. I shook my head, my own hands flying to my ears, trying to block out the piercing wail. But it was no use. The sound was everywhere, inside our heads, inside our bodies, vibrating through the very air around us. We closer now, much closer, right outside the clearing, right at the edge of the trees. And then it stopped, abruptly, silence again. But this time, the silence was different again, not expectant, not oppressive. This time, it was predatory, like something had just found its prey, and it was about to strike. And then, we heard it, a new sound, and this time, it was coming from inside the tent, from right next to us. A soft, wet, gurgling sound, like liquid being sucked through a straw. Gurgle, gurgle, we both froze, our blood turning to ice, our eyes wide with a new, even more terrifying horror. The sound was coming from between us, from right there, in the narrow space between our sleeping bags, from the ground beneath us. Gurgle, gurgle louder now, more insistent, and then the ground beneath us started to vibrate, a low, rhythmic pulsing that resonated through our bodies. The tent floor beneath us felt soft, spongy, Like it was giving way, I looked down, my eyes straining in the darkness. And then, I saw it. In the faint moonlight filtering through the tent fabric, I saw it. Right there, between our sleeping bags in the center of the tent floor. A dark, wet patch, spreading rapidly, growing larger with each passing second. And in the center of the patch, a small, dark hole, oozing something. Something thick, black and viscous. Something that was bubbling. Gurgle, 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 the sound was coming from the hole. From beneath the tent floor. From somewhere deep below. And the hole was getting bigger, the dark patch spreading, the ground vibrating more intensely. It was like something was rising. From beneath the earth. Right there, right beneath us. And then, the whisper came again. Closer this time. Louder, more insistent, and this time it wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. Come out and play. Come out and play. The whisper echoed in my head, a chilling invitation that made my blood run cold. The gurgling from beneath the tent floor intensified, the dark, wet patch spreading, the hole in the center growing larger, oozing that viscous black substance. The ground beneath us vibrated with increasing intensity, like something huge and monstrous was stirring beneath the surface, preparing to break through. Mark and I scrambled back, away from the spreading stain, pressing ourselves against opposite walls of the tent, as far away from the center as we could get. Our eyes were fixed on the growing hole, wide with a terror that transcended words. We were trapped, cornered, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The flimsy nylon of the tent, which had offered a fragile sense of security just moments before, now felt like a coffin, sealing us in with whatever was rising from beneath. The gurgling reached a crescendo, a sickening, bubbling sound that filled the tent, drowning out even the frantic pounding of my heart. The dark hole pulsed, widened, and then something started to emerge. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, something black and slick began to push its way through the hole in the tent floor. It was amorphous at first, a shifting, shapeless mass of darkness, oozing and writhing like a living oil slick. Then, as it rose further, a form began to coalesce, a grotesque, nightmarish shape that defied description. It was fleshy, but not like human flesh. More like decayed meat, bloated and distended, slick with a viscous slime that glistened in the faint moonlight. The color was all wrong, too not pink or red or even grey, but a deep, unnatural black. The same bottomless blackness as the eye we'd seen at the door. And it moved with a sickening fluidity, a boundless, slithering motion that was deeply unsettling to watch. As it rose higher, I could make out protrusions, lumps and bumps and fleshy tendrils that writhed and pulsed, extending from the central mass-like grotesque limbs. Some were thick and blunt, ending in bulbous tips that oozed black fluid. Others were thin and whip-like, lashing out randomly, twitching and probbing the air. And some were tipped with something sharp, something hard and glistening that looked disturbingly like claws or teeth. The smell intensified, becoming almost unbearable. The stench of rotting meat and wet fur was now overlaid with a new odor, something acrid and chemical, like burning plastic and spoiled eggs. It filled the tent, choking us, making our eyes water and our stomachs heave. Mark gagged, a strangled, retching sound, and turned his head away, burying his face in his sleeping bag. I wanted to do the same, to shut out the sight and smell of the thing rising from the floor. But I couldn't. I was frozen, mesmerized by horror, unable to tear my eyes away from the grotesque spectacle unfolding before me. The creature continued to rise, pushing its way further through the hole, its amorphous form solidifying, becoming more defined. I could now see a torso of sorts, a bloated, distended mass of black flesh, supported by thick, pulsing tendrils that served as legs, and above the torso a head, or something that resembled a head. It was round and bulbous, like a swollen tumor, with no discernible features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, black surface, glistening with slime, pulsating faintly, like a heartbeat. Except there was one feature. In the center of the bulbous head, where a face should have been, there was a single, gaping hole. Not a natural hole, not an orifice, but something carved out. Like someone had taken a scoop and gouged out a chunk of flesh, leaving behind a ragged, circular opening that was lined with teeth. Not teeth like human teeth or animal teeth, but rows upon rows of needle-sharp, black spines arranged in concentric circles, radiating inwards towards the darkness within. And from the hole, from the darkness within, came the sound. Not the gurgling this time, not the whispering, not the keening wail. This time, it was singing. A low, guttural humming, a deep, resonant drone that vibrated in my chest, that resonated with the pulsing of the creature's flesh. It was a sound that was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight into my soul. It was a song of darkness, a hymn of the void, a melody of pure, unadulterated evil. As the creature sang, the black spines in the whole of its head began to vibrate, to shimmer, to glow with an inner light. Not a warm, comforting light, but a cold, malevolent luminescence, like the light of dying stars or the glow of phosphorescent decay. The light pulsed in time with the humming, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the tent walls, twisting and distorting the already grotesque shape of the creature into even more nightmarish forms. The humming intensified, growing louder, more resonant, more hypnotic. I felt myself swaying, my eyelids growing heavy, my mind starting to drift, to succumb to the creature's song. It was like a siren's call, luring me towards oblivion, promising release from fear, from pain, from consciousness itself. I fought against it, desperately clinging to the last vestiges of my will, my sanity. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind, to break free from the creature's spell. But the humming was too strong, too pervasive, too seductive. I could feel myself slipping, sliding down into the darkness, drawn towards the gaping hole in the creature's head, towards the black spines, towards the oblivion within. Suddenly, a sharp pain jolted through me, snapping me back to reality. Mark! He'd kicked me hard, in the shin. The pain was excruciating, but it was also liberating. It broke the creature's hold on me, shattered the hypnotic spell of its song. I gasped, sucking in air, my lungs burning, my head spinning. I blinked, focusing my eyes, and saw Mark, his face pale but determined, his eyes fixed on me, urging me to stay awake to fight back. He nodded his head towards the creature, his eyes wide with terror, but also with a spark of defiance. I looked back at the creature. It was still rising, still humming, still glowing. But now, the spell was broken. I could see it for what it was, a monster, a nightmare made flesh, a thing of pure evil that had no right to exist in this world. And something inside me, something buried deep beneath the fear, began to stir. Anger, resentment, a primal urge to survive, to fight back against this unholy abomination. I reached for my knife, the sturdy blade my grandpa had given me, the one I'd almost forgotten I had. My fingers fumbled for the handle, my hands shaking, but I managed to grasp it, to draw it from its sheath. The cold steel felt strangely reassuring in my trembling hand, a tangible weapon against the intangible horror before us. I looked at Mark. He understood. He nodded again, his eyes locking with mine, a silent pact forming between us. We were in this together. We would fight, we would survive, or we would die trying. Taking a deep breath, I lunged forward towards the creature, towards the gaping hole in its head, towards the glowing black spines. I raised my knife, aiming for the center of the hole, for the darkness within, for the source of the humming, for the heart of the evil that had invaded our tent, our woods, our lives. Jet away from us, I screamed, my voice hoarse, cracking, but filled with a desperate rage. Get out of our woods. The creature paused, its humming faltering for a moment, its bulbous head turning slowly towards me, the black spines in its gaping hole flickering, dimming slightly. It was like it was surprised, confused, like it hadn't expected us to fight back. And in that moment of hesitation, I struck. I plunged my knife into the hole in the creature's head, burying the blade deep into the darkness within, right up to the hilt. There was a sickening squelch, a wet, tearing sound, and then something exploded. Not a literal explosion, not fire or shrapnel, but something else. A wave of pure, raw energy erupted from the hole in the creature's head, a blast of cold, black energy that slammed into me, throwing me backwards, slamming me against the tent wall. The humming stopped, abruptly, replaced by a high, pitched shriek, a sound of pure agony and rage that tore through the tent, that ripped at my eardrums, that made my teeth ache. The creature convulsed violently, its fleshy tendrils thrashing wildly, its bulbous head twisting and contorting in a grotesque parody of pain. The black spines in its head flared, burning with an intense, malevolent light, and then they went out. Extinguished, like candles snuffed by a sudden gust of wind. The creature shuddered, its convulsing movements slowing, weakening. The black slime that coated its flesh seemed to recede, to dry up, leaving behind a dull grey surface. The pulsing of its flesh faded, the rhythmic vibrations ceasing. The smell began to dissipate, the acrid stench fading, replaced by the lingering odour of damp earth and decaying leaves. And then, with a final shuddering sigh, the creature collapsed. Its amorphous form slumped to the tent floor, a deflated, lifeless mass of grey flesh and limp tendrils. The hole in its head remained, gaping and empty, but the black spines were gone, the darkness within no longer glowing, no longer singing. It was just a hole, in a dead thing, silence descended again, but this time it was different. Not oppressive, not expectant, not predatory. This time it was empty, hollow, like something vital, something essential had been extinguished, leaving behind only a void. Mark and I lay slumped against the tent walls, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling, our minds reeling. We stared at the lifeless mass on the tent floor, at the knife hilt protruding from the hole in its head, at the spreading stain of dark fluid that was no longer bubbling, no longer oozing. We had done it. We had fought back. We had survived. Against something impossible. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that had come from somewhere else. But the silence was still unsettling. The woods were still dark. And the feeling of being watched, that feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it felt stronger now, more intense, more focused. Like we had just injured something far bigger, far more powerful than the creature we had just slain. Like we had just poked a hornet's nest. And the hornets were coming. The silence after the creature's demise was heavy, laden with a sense of foreboding that eclipsed even the terror we'd just endured. We'd killed something. But the woods didn't feel safer. If anything, they felt more menacing, more alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on us like a physical weight. It was as if the creature we'd slain was just a scout, a mere tendril of something larger, something ancient, and now the main body was aware of our presence, aware of our defiance. Mark and I remained frozen against the tent walls, our eyes darting around, straining to pierce the oppressive darkness outside. The dead creature lay between us, a gruesome monument to our desperate struggle, a chilling reminder of the horrors lurking in Blackwood forest. The knife, still embedded in its head, seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy, a resonance of the evil we had just confronted. Where we did it. Mark whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. He sounded more bewildered than relieved. Yeah, I croaked, my throat raw, my voice trembling. We did. But the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the overwhelming dread that still gripped us. Victory felt incomplete, temporary. Neither of us moved for a long moment, paralyzed by exhaustion and lingering fear. The only sound was the rustling of leaves, the sighing of the wind, and the frantic thumping of our own hearts, slowly beginning to return to a semblance of normalcy. But even those familiar sounds seemed tainted now, imbued with a sinister undertone, a constant reminder that we were not alone, that we were intruders in a place that did not welcome us. We need to get out of here, I said finally, the urgency in my voice cutting through the lingering silence. No, Mark nodded, his eyes wide and agreeing. Yeah, you're right, let's go. But moving felt like an impossible task. Our limbs were heavy, laden with fatigue and fear. Our minds were numb, struggling to process the horrors we had just witnessed. Just the thought of venturing back out into the darkness, into the woods that now felt actively hostile, was almost unbearable. Where we should pack up, Mark stammered, gesturing vaguely at our scattered gear. Tent sleeping bags. Forget it, I said, shaking my head. Leave it. It's not worth it. We just need to run. Now, Mark hesitated, glancing at our meager possessions, the remnants of our ill-fated adventure. But he saw the look in my eyes, the raw terror that still gripped me, and he didn't argue. He knew I was right. Our lives were worth more than a rusty tent and some mouldy sleeping bags. We scrambled to our feet, stumbling over the dead creature, our eyes averted from its grotesque form. We unzipped the tent door, peering out into the darkness. The woods were still silent, but the feeling of being watched was palpable, almost suffocating. It felt like the trees themselves were observing us, their branches like gnarled fingers pointing accusingly, their leaves whispering warnings on the wind. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the tent, Mark right behind me. We didn't bother with flashlights, didn't dare to break the silence with unnecessary noise. We just started to run. We ran blindly, desperately, crashing through the undergrowth, stumbling over roots and fallen logs, our lungs burning, our legs aching. We didn't follow the trail, didn't know where we were going, didn't care. We just ran away from the clearing, away from tent, away from the dead creature, away from the unseen horrors of Blackwood forest. Branches whipped at our faces, thorns tore at our clothes, the rough ground scraped at our ankles, but we didn't stop. We ran on adrenaline and fear, driven by a primal instinct to escape, to survive. The sounds of the woods pursued us, rustling leaves, snapping twigs. The sighing wind all twisted into something sinister, something threatening. We imagined we could hear whispers on the wind, faint distorted echoes of the creature's song, urging us to stop, to turn back, to surrender to the darkness. But we didn't stop. We kept running, pushing ourselves beyond our limits, fueled by the terror that gnawed at our insides. We ran until our lungs screamed for air, until our legs threatened to buckle beneath us, until our minds started to blur, to lose track of time and distance. Finally, as the first faint hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky a pale, bruised purple, we stumbled out of the trees. We collapsed onto the side of the deserted country road, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking, our clothes torn and mud, stained, our faces scratched and bleeding. We were out of the woods, we were alive. But we were changed. Forever. We lay there for a long time, just breathing, just existing, too exhausted, too traumatized to speak. The sounds of the forest still echoed in our ears, the image of the creature still burned in our minds. The smell of its decay still lingered in our nostrils. We were physically out of Blackwood, but a part of us, a dark, terrified part, would always remain trapped within its shadows. As the sun rose higher, casting a weak, watery light over the landscape, the familiar shapes of Havenwood began to emerge from the mist. Cornfields, farmhouses, paved roads, the mundane, ordinary world. A stark contrast to the nightmarish wilderness we had just escaped. It felt surreal, like we had stepped out of a nightmare and back into reality, but the nightmare was still clinging to us, a dark stain on our souls. We walked back to Mark's car parked at the trailhead, our movements slow, mechanical like automatons. We didn't speak, didn't look at each other, didn't acknowledge the horrors we had shared. We just moved, driven by a silent, unspoken understanding that we needed to get away, to get back to civilization, to try to forget, even though we knew we never truly could. The drive back to Havenwood was silent, strained. The familiar landscape, once so boring, now seemed almost comforting, safe. But even the normalcy of our small town couldn't fully dispel the darkness that clung to us, the lingering fear that whispered in the back of our minds. We never spoke about what happened in Blackwood Forest. Not to each other, not to anyone else. We buried it deep inside, a shared secret, a silent trauma that bound us together and yet kept us apart. We went back to our lives, to our summer jobs, to the soul-crushing monotony of Havenwood. But everything was different now. The world seemed thinner, more fragile. The veil between reality and nightmare somehow weakened, permeable. I still see Mark around town sometimes. We nod to each other, a brief, strained acknowledgement, but we never talk about Kit. We don't need to. We both know. We both remember. We both carry the scars, invisible to the outside world, but etched deep into our souls. I never went back to the woods. Not to Blackwood, not to any woods. The whisper in the leaves, the call of the wild, is silent to me now. Replaced by a different whisper, a darker whisper, a warning that echoes in my mind whenever I even think about venturing into the trees. You shouldn't be here. And I know now what it means. Some places are not meant for us. Some darkness is best left undisturbed. Some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed. And Blackwood Forest is one of those places. A place where the veil is thin, where nightmares walk, and where the whispers in the woods are not promises of adventure, but chilling warnings of the horrors that lie waiting in the darkness. I still have the knife. I keep it hidden, locked away, a dark memento of that night in Blackwood. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the darkness presses in, I take it out, hold it in my hand, and remember. Remember the fear, the horror, the creature, the whisper. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that Blackwood Forest is still out there, waiting, watching, and listening for the unwary souls who dare to trespass into its domain. And I know too that someday the whispers might call again, and next time I might not be strong enough to resist.